Patrick says he's innocent. That word is doing a lot of work right now, and none of it is helping the people who were actually harmed. Because innocence, in the legal sense, is not a personality trait. It's a status that exists until a court decides otherwise. And nothing about this case suddenly makes sense just because Patrick Rourke bonded out and started moving like the story reset. It didn't. What it did was expose something people don't like to talk about: how fast sympathy travels upward once someone accused of harm knows how to perform victimhood. Patrick is out. That doesn't mean he walked free on his own recognizance. Someone posted money. Someone decided he deserved help. And almost immediately, what happened next was predictable. A GoFundMe, not for the Whittakers, not for reunification, not for warmth, food, legal advocacy, or stability for the people whose lives were put on display. For Patrick, living expenses, legal battle help, support. That's where this stops being confusing and starts being insulting. Let's slow this down. Patrick said he was going to pay the Whittakers. He didn't. That's not rumor. That's not interpretation. That's a promise followed by nothing. And when someone shows you they will lie to your face about money owed to vulnerable people, credibility doesn't just crack, it collapses. So when people ask, "Why don't you believe him now?" the answer is simple: because he already showed who he is when it mattered. Here's the question that won't go away, no matter how many times people try to redirect it. If Patrick truly cared about Timmy Whittaker, why was everything he did with Timmy turned into content? Name one meaningful moment that wasn't filmed. One private act of care that didn't end up monetized. You can't. Because Timmy wasn't just a person in Patrick's life. He was the centerpiece of the brand. And when someone's entire relationship with a disabled adult exists through a camera lens, that's not companionship. That's extraction. People keep saying, "But Timmy got to do things." Yes, Timmy went places. But look closer. They were places Patrick wanted to go. And when Timmy went along, Patrick got content, sympathy, engagement, money. So whose experience was it really? If a trip exists because it produces content and revenue, it's not generosity. It's business. And Timmy didn't get paid. Now let's talk about priorities, because priorities tell the truth even when words don't. Around the same time the Whittakers needed money for windows, for stability, for basic needs, Patrick was out here securing guitars. Expensive guitars. Multiple guitars. Not quietly, publicly, played on camera. So ask yourself this, honestly. If someone claims they can't pay a family they owe, but can still upgrade their personal life, what exactly are they saying about whose needs matter? Because money doesn't disappear, it moves. Here's another thing that changed how a lot of people see this. Accounts have now come out saying that before the money, before the cameras, Patrick wasn't a benevolent presence around the Whittakers. Throwing rocks, bullying behavior, disrespect. Those claims didn't come from nowhere. They came from family. And once you see Patrick's later behavior, dismissive, controlling, contemptuous, those early accusations stop sounding unbelievable. They start sounding consistent. This is where people get uncomfortable and say, "But you gave him the benefit of the doubt before." Yes, I did. And that's not a flaw. Giving someone the benefit of the doubt is not the same as refusing to update your beliefs when evidence shows up. I don't punish people for accusations. I judge them by patterns. Patrick's pattern is now clear. Now let's talk about the GoFundMe itself. because this is where the audacity becomes undeniable. A fundraiser asking for help with Patrick's living expenses while the Whittakers are split up. Their home situation remains unstable. Their income from content is disputed. Their names were used to generate donations they may never have received. That's not just tone deaf. That's a slap in the face. It says, without saying it, I matter more than the people I said I was helping. Some people try to soften this by saying, well, he denies the charges. Of course he does. Everyone denies charges. Denial is not evidence. It's strategy. And here's the part that matters more than what Patrick says. Even if every criminal charge disappeared tomorrow, the ethical violations would still stand. Not paying people you profit from is exploitation. Monetizing a disabled adult without safeguards is exploitation. Breaking up a family and doing nothing to repair it is exploitation. Courts don't define morality. They define legality. Those are not the same thing. This brings us to Eric Carroll, because people keep trying to frame this as a one-man story. It isn't. Patrick may have been the face, but Eric was part of the structure. Control of accounts, control of narrative, control of access. And yes, Eric denies guilt. But here's the question no one answers. If you see exploitation happening, and you continue operating the system that enables it, what exactly are you innocent of? You don't need to steal money personally to be responsible for where it goes. You just need to keep the machine running. People keep asking, why hasn't Eric been charged? That's a legal question, but the moral question is different. Did he benefit from the content? Help manage donations? Stand by while promises weren't kept? Participate while the family was torn apart? If the answer is yes, then not charged yet doesn't mean not responsible. It means the investigation hasn't reached its endpoint. Here's what makes this entire situation feel so wrong. Everyone came here for the Whittakers, for their safety, for their dignity, for their stability. Somewhere along the way, the focus shifted. Now people are fundraising for the man accused of exploiting them. That's not confusion. That's inversion. So when Patrick says he's innocent, here's the only honest response. Innocent of what? Of charges not yet proven? That's for court. Of lying? No. Of exploiting Timmy? The pattern says otherwise. Of benefiting while others suffered? Absolutely not. Nothing about this case makes sense because the people who were harmed keep getting deprioritized. And that tells you everything. Does denying charges change how you see the exploitation? Or does the money trail matter more to you? This is where the case stops being confusing and starts being offensive. Because the moment Patrick Rourke bonded out, the next move was not reflection, silence, or accountability. It was money, another GoFundMe, another appeal, another attempt to convert sympathy into cash. And that alone tells you more than any denial ever could. Let's talk about timing, because timing never lies. Patrick bonds out. Almost immediately, a fundraiser appears. Not for restitution, not for the people he said he loved, not for the family whose lives were monetized. For him, living expenses, legal battle help, support. Ask yourself something simple and uncomfortable. Why is it always easier to raise money for the accused than for the exploited? People keep asking why this feels so wrong. Here's why. The Whittakers were the reason donations ever existed in the first place. Their lives, their hardship, their vulnerability, their names. Money came in because of them. So, when the next fundraiser centers Patrick, after everything, it doesn't feel like generosity. It feels like a reversal of reality. Let's be clear about one thing before anyone twists it. Patrick has the right to deny charges. Patrick has the right to defend himself legally. What he does not have is the moral right to re-enter the donation economy built on the backs of people he never properly paid. That's not defense. That's entitlement. Here's the part people don't want to say out loud. If Patrick truly believed he did nothing wrong, morally, he would not be asking strangers to carry the weight of consequences tied to the Whittakers' suffering. He would be selling assets, downsizing, living within his means, handling his situation privately. Instead, guitars stayed, lifestyle stayed, appeals went public. That's not necessity. That's audacity. And yes, let's talk about the guitars, because symbols matter. Around the same period when the Whittakers needed money for windows, stability, basic needs, Patrick was acquiring guitars. Not quietly, not reluctantly, proudly, displayed, played, shown off. So, when a fundraiser asks for help with living expenses, the question isn't cruel. It's obvious. Why are personal upgrades protected, but the people you profited from were left waiting? People try to defend this by saying, well, he was injured. Fine, but injury does not erase obligation. Being hurt does not nullify debts. Being injured does not excuse exploitation. Being in trouble does not entitle you to more money when you haven't made others whole. Especially not when the money you're asking for comes from the same audience that believed you were helping the Whittakers. Now, let's talk about messaging. The GoFundMe language matters. It frames Patrick as struggling, misunderstood, unfairly accused, in need of support. Notice who's missing. The Whittakers, Timmy Whittaker, the family that was split, the people whose names fueled the donations. They're gone from the narrative. And when the harmed party disappears from the story, that's not accidental. That's strategy. Here's where people get defensive and say, but what if the Whittakers have been taken care of? That's speculation. And speculation does not erase responsibility. Because if they had been taken care of, transparently, fully, ethically, this entire situation would look different. There would be proof, accounting, closure, silence. Instead, there's confusion, deflection, fundraisers for the accused, and a family still split apart. Those things don't coexist with restitution. This is also where Eric Carroll comes back into the frame, because Patrick didn't control everything alone. Eric was involved with accounts, platforms, narrative control, access. So, when people say, why hasn't Eric been charged? They're asking a legal question. But here's the ethical one. If you are part of a system that monetizes a vulnerable family, and you benefit from that system, do you get to walk away clean just because someone else is charged first? The law may say not yet. Morality doesn't wait. Now, let's address the flip-flop accusation. Changing your view when facts change is not flip-flopping. It's integrity. Refusing to update your beliefs when evidence piles up, that's loyalty to a lie. I believed Patrick until he showed me I shouldn't. That moment came when promises weren't kept, money didn't arrive, excuses piled up, contempt replaced care. At that point, continuing to believe him would have been denial. People keep trying to separate Patrick's words from his actions. That doesn't work anymore. His actions say, Timmy was content. The family was optional. Payment was conditional. Accountability was inconvenient. No denial erases that pattern. Here's something else that makes this GoFundMe especially disturbing. It normalizes the idea that exploiting vulnerable people is survivable, even profitable, if you're charismatic enough. Because look at the sequence. Monetize a vulnerable family, fail to pay them, get arrested, bond out, raise money again. That tells future exploiters exactly what the risk is. Minimal, and that's dangerous. This is why people saying, "Let the courts handle it," is not enough. Courts decide charges. They don't repair harm. They don't reverse exploitation. They don't reunite families. And they certainly don't stop audiences from funding the wrong person. That responsibility sits with us. So when you see a fundraiser like this, the real question isn't, is Patrick innocent? It's this: why is he still being rewarded while the Whittakers remain fractured? Why is sympathy flowing upward again? Why are people so quick to rescue the person accused of harm, but so slow to demand justice for the people harmed? Here's the truth people don't want to sit with. Supporting Patrick right now isn't neutral. It's a statement. It says, exploitation isn't a deal breaker. Charm outweighs harm. Vulnerability is secondary. Accountability is optional. And once that becomes acceptable, the system never corrects itself. So no, nothing about this case makes sense, because the moral compass keeps spinning toward the loudest voice instead of the quietest victims. And until that changes, no denial, no bond, no fundraiser will ever make this feel right. Why do audiences repeatedly protect the exploiter instead of the exploited, even when the evidence is right in front of them? Because understanding that is the only way this cycle breaks. Should fundraisers ever exist for someone accused of exploiting the very people who made them money? Yes or no? This is the part nobody likes, because it forces people to look inward instead of pointing outward. By now, the pattern around Patrick Rourke is not subtle. Promises made, promises broken, money flowing in one direction, responsibility flowing in none. And yet, people are still defending him, still donating, still rationalizing, still attacking anyone who asks uncomfortable questions. So the real question isn't what did Patrick do? It's why so many people are willing to excuse it. The savior illusion is hard to let go of. When people first encountered Patrick, he wasn't framed as a businessman or content creator. He was framed as a helper, a rescuer, someone who saw the Whittakers when others didn't. That framing matters, because once someone is emotionally labeled a savior, criticism feels cruel. Questioning them feels like attacking goodness itself. So when evidence appears that the savior exploited the very people he claimed to protect, the brain does something uncomfortable. It resists. Cognitive dissonance does the heavy lifting. Here's the psychological conflict people face. I believe this person was good. Evidence suggests this person caused harm. Holding both ideas at once is painful. So instead of revising belief, many people revise reality. They say, it's complicated. There's more we don't know. Everyone makes mistakes. The family benefited too. These phrases aren't explanations. They're coping mechanisms. Because admitting exploitation means admitting you were wrong and that your support may have contributed to harm. That's a hard pill to swallow. Why victims get scrutinized more than accused. Notice how quickly the focus shifts away from the Whittakers. People start asking, did they really not get paid? Are we sure they didn't benefit? Why didn't they speak up sooner? But those same people rarely ask, why didn't Patrick provide proof? Why was money delayed? Why was everything conditional? This imbalance is telling. We live in a culture that interrogates victims for inconsistencies while excusing power for patterns. And Patrick had power, social, financial, narrative, so he got grace. The Whittakers got doubt. Timmy's silence made defense easier. This part matters more than most people want to admit. Timmy Whittaker is nonverbal and cognitively impaired. He could not come online and say, "I didn't consent. I wasn't paid. I felt used. I want this to stop." So others spoke for him. And when those voices contradicted the feel-good narrative, they were dismissed as drama, jealousy, or interference. Silence was mistaken for agreement. That's not neutrality. That's vulnerability being exploited twice. Once for content, once for defense. How? At least he got experiences became a shield. One of the most repeated defenses is this: "At least Timmy got to do things." That sentence sounds compassionate. It isn't, because experiences do not justify exploitation. If a disabled adult is taken places while being filmed, being monetized, being unpaid, being separated from family, those experiences are not gifts. They're transactions. And when people defend exploitation by pointing to moments of fun, they reduce a human being to a highlight reel. The role of Eric Carroll in maintaining the narrative. This is where Eric Carroll becomes essential to understanding the defense. Eric didn't need to be charged to be influential. He was part of the structure, managing accounts, shaping explanations, buffering criticism, normalizing delays. That role matters, because when someone consistently reframes concerns instead of resolving them, they train the audience to distrust critics instead of asking for proof. And once an audience is trained that way, accountability becomes harassment and questions become hate. Popularity creates moral blind spots. Patrick's visibility worked in his favor. People felt like they knew him, like they understood him, like they could read his intentions. But familiarity is not character. In fact, the more visible someone is, the easier it becomes to confuse performance with truth, especially online. So when accusations arose, people defaulted to, "I've watched him. He wouldn't do that. I trust him." That trust wasn't earned through accountability. It was earned through exposure. Why bonding out felt like validation to some. When Patrick bonded out, many supporters felt relief, not because justice was served, but because their belief system was preserved. Bonding out allowed them to say, "See, he's fine. This is overblown. He's not that bad." But bond is procedure, not proof. It doesn't erase unpaid labor, monetized vulnerability, broken promises, family separation. It simply buys time, and time is often mistaken for innocence. The gendered reality no one wants to say out loud. A large portion of Patrick's most vocal defenders are women. That's not an insult. It's an observation. Many of them didn't just support him, they identified with him. They felt chosen, seen, valued. So criticism of Patrick felt personal, because if Patrick exploited the Whittakers, what does that say about the attention he gave them? This is how parasocial dynamics protect harm. People defend not the person, but the version of themselves that felt special through him. Why people attack the messenger. Anyone who speaks critically gets labeled jealous, bitter, obsessed, a hateful, clout-chasing. That's not coincidence. That's a tactic. Discredit the speaker so the message can be ignored, because engaging with the substance would require confronting uncomfortable truths. Exploitation doesn't look like villainy. This is the final psychological hurdle. People expect exploitation to look evil, sneering, cruel, obvious, but real exploitation often looks like smiles, jokes, generosity, help, relatability. That's why it works. Patrick didn't need to be monstrous. He just needed to benefit while others waited. And that's exactly what happened. The pattern is the proof. At some point, individual explanations stop mattering. Because patterns don't lie. Pattern of promises without delivery. Pattern of content without compensation. Pattern of upgrades while others struggled. Pattern of deflection when questioned. Pattern of sympathy flowing upward. You don't need intent to see impact. Impact is already here. Why this matters beyond this case. If people keep defending this behavior, it sends a message that vulnerable families are acceptable collateral, that exploitation is forgivable if packaged well, that charm outranks accountability, that content justifies control. And once that message settles, the next family is already at risk. Where this leaves us, by now, one thing should be clear. People didn't defend Patrick because they hate the Whittakers. They defended him because belief is comforting, doubt is painful, accountability threatens identity, but comfort is not justice, and belief does not protect the vulnerable. What accountability actually looks like, and why waiting for the courts is not enough. Because if standards don't change, this story will repeat. Different names, same harm. Why do you think people protect a narrative longer than they protect the people harmed by it? Loyalty, denial, or fear of being wrong? This is the part where people usually say, let the courts handle it. It sounds responsible. It sounds neutral. It sounds mature. And it is also how harm gets quietly normalized while everyone waits for a verdict that was never designed to answer the real questions. Because courts decide criminal liability, they do not decide moral responsibility, ethical failure, or systemic harm. And this case has already crossed those lines. Let's say this plainly. Even if Patrick Rourke were never convicted of a single charge, the exploitation questions would still exist. Why? Because accountability is not a courtroom outcome. It's a standard of conduct. And that standard was violated long before any arrest. The myth that no charges means no harm. People keep circling one question like it's a shield. Why hasn't Eric Carroll been charged? That question matters legally, but it is meaningless ethically, because harm does not require charges to be real. If that were true, unpaid labor wouldn't count as exploitation. Monetized vulnerability wouldn't count as harm. Family separation wouldn't count unless criminalized. That's not how reality works. Charges are a threshold. Harm is an outcome, and the outcomes are already visible. What accountability actually means in real life. Accountability is not jail time, humiliation, endless outrage. Accountability is alignment. It asks whether actions matched obligations and what happens when they didn't. So let's apply that standard here. Patrick benefited from content built on the Whittakers' lives, attention driven by Timmy's vulnerability, donations generated in the family's name. His obligation was to pay them, to protect their dignity, to prioritize their needs over his own. That alignment failed. No verdict changes that. Why good intentions don't save bad outcomes. This is where defenders get stuck. They say, I think he meant well. I don't think he planned harm. I think it got out of hand. Maybe, but intentions don't repair outcomes. If someone drives drunk without intending harm and crashes into a family, the damage still exists. Impact is not erased by motive. And when vulnerable people are involved, impact is the only metric that matters. The accountability Patrick has never shown. If Patrick were serious about accountability, we would have seen certain things by now. Not words, actions. We would have seen transparent accounting of all money raised, proof of payment to the Whittakers, restitution before fundraising for himself, silence instead of self-centered appeals, acknowledgement of harm without defensiveness. We have seen none of that. Instead, we saw deflection, denial, fundraising, lifestyle preservation, sympathy redirection. That's not accountability. That's avoidance. The role Eric Carroll cannot step away from. Now, let's talk about Eric, not in terms of guilt, but responsibility. If you are involved in managing platforms, controlling access, shaping narratives, overseeing donation flows, you don't get to say, "I didn't do the exploiting," because exploitation is rarely one person's job. It's a system, and systems persist because people maintain them. Standing by while harm occurs, especially when you benefit, is not neutrality. It's participation. Why waiting for the courts is convenient. Waiting for a court decision allows everyone else to do nothing. It means donors don't have to rethink their support. Creators don't have to question amplification. Audiences don't have to confront complicity. Everyone gets to pause accountability and call it patience. But patience without standards is just permission. The question courts will never answer. Here's the question the legal system is not built to resolve. Was it acceptable to turn a disabled adult into content without enforceable safeguards? Courts can rule on fraud. They can rule on theft. They can rule on specific statutes. They do not rule on dignity. That's on us. Why Timmy is still the center, even if people avoid his name. Every attempt to reframe this story away from Timmy Whittaker is telling. Because Timmy represents the thing people don't want to confront. He could not consent. He could not negotiate. He could not withdraw. He could not speak up. So others spoke over him. And once that happens, accountability is not optional. It is mandatory. The accountability that actually matters now. Here's what accountability would look like today, regardless of court outcomes. No more fundraisers tied to the accused. Until restitution and transparency occur, fundraising is unethical. Public acknowledgement of power imbalance. Not mistakes were made. Clear recognition that vulnerability was leveraged. Permanent standards for content involving vulnerable adults. No filming without oversight. No monetization without contracts. No intermediaries without accountability. Centering the family's needs, not the creator's survival. The Whittakers' stability matters more than anyone's comfort. Anything less is performance. Why moving on is the most dangerous option. People want closure. They want the noise to stop. They want the drama to end. They want the discomfort to fade. But moving on without standards guarantees repetition. Because the lesson becomes exploit quietly, apologize vaguely, wait it out, fundraise again, and that lesson will be learned. Accountability is a boundary, not a grudge. This isn't about punishing Patrick forever. It's not about hating Eric. It's not about endless outrage. It's about drawing a line and saying, this behavior is not acceptable. This structure is not defensible. This harm will not be minimized. Then you move forward with rules where this leaves the case. At this point, the question is no longer, is Patrick innocent? The real question is, what are we willing to tolerate from people who profit off vulnerability? If the answer is a lot, as long as they're likable, then this will happen again. If the answer is nothing without structure, then something actually changes. The rules that must exist before anyone is ever allowed to help a vulnerable family again. Because without rules, there is no accountability, only cycles. Do you think accountability should exist before court outcomes or only after? This is where the story has to stop looping, not with a verdict, not with a fundraiser, not with who people like more. It ends with rules, because without rules, everything you just watched becomes a rehearsal for the next vulnerable family. So let's say this plainly. What happened to the Whittakers didn't happen because one person was bad. It happened because there were no enforced boundaries when money, content, and vulnerability collided. And until those boundaries exist, nothing actually changes. Rule 1. No authority, no access. This is non-negotiable. Before anyone helps, films, transports, advocates for, or fundraises around a vulnerable family, one question must be answered in writing. Who has legal authority? Who can consent? Who can refuse? Who can stop the arrangement? If that answer isn't documented, everything stops. No exceptions for good intentions. No shortcuts, because someone had to help. No improvising, because the story is emotional. Absence of authority is how exploitation begins. Rule 2. Money and control can never be in the same hands. This rule alone would have prevented most of the harm. The person who controls donations, controls access, controls filming, controls messaging, cannot be the same person, ever, because once money and access live together, power concentrates. And concentrated power over vulnerable people always gets abused, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, sometimes by accident. No personal accounts, no private fundraisers. No, I'll handle it. If money can't be audited, it can't be trusted. Rule 3. Content is a privilege, not a requirement. This needs to be said without apology. Care does not require a camera. If help disappears without filming, it was never help. Vulnerable people are not storylines, episodes, engagement drivers, proof of kindness. If someone cannot be helped off camera, they should not be helped on camera. Anything else is exploitation dressed as generosity. Rule 4. Consent must be legal, informed, and revocable. This is where everything collapsed. Timmy Whittaker could not legally or meaningfully consent to being filmed, monetized, moved, or used as content. Smiling is not consent. Compliance is not consent. Participation is not consent. If a person cannot understand the arrangement, say no, withdraw later, then the answer is already no. No amount of "but he seemed happy" overrides that. Rule 5. No one gets to be indispensable. This is the quietest danger. The moment someone becomes the only one who understands, the only one they trust, the only one helping, the system has failed. Real help builds redundancy. It welcomes oversight. It plans for replacement. If everything collapses, when one person leaves, that person had too much power. Rule 6. Accountability comes before sympathy. This is the one people resist the hardest. Sympathy should never outrun accountability. Before fundraisers, before defenses, before benefit of the doubt speeches, if someone benefited while others suffered, accountability comes first. That means transparency, restitution, acknowledgement of harm, not excuses, not timing, not wait and see. Applying this to the case everyone is still arguing about, So let's bring this back to the question in the title. Patrick says he's innocent. Legally, that's for court. But ethically, the rules were broken. Patrick Rourke benefited from content built on vulnerability. Promises were made and not kept. Money flowed upward while the family waited. That's exploitation by outcome, regardless of intent. And Eric Carroll doesn't escape scrutiny just because charges haven't landed. If you help run the system, you own the outcomes of that system. Standing by while harm occurs is not innocence. It's participation. Why this isn't about picking sides. This is where people get defensive. They think rules mean punishment. They think accountability means hatred. They think boundaries mean cancellation. It doesn't. It means standards. Standards protect everyone. The vulnerable, the helpers, the public, even the accused. Because without standards, everyone becomes fair game. The hardest truth in this entire story. Here it is, and there's no soft way to say it. The Whittakers were content. Timmy was content. And once a human being becomes content, their humanity becomes negotiable unless rules stop it. That's what failed here. Not compassion, not attention, rules. If this story ends without these rules, it will repeat. Different name, different platform, same pattern. A vulnerable family, a charismatic helper, a donation pipeline, a blurred line between help and control, and an audience that doesn't ask hard questions until it's too late. That's the real danger. So this is the end, or the reset. If you take nothing else from this, take this. Helping vulnerable people is not a vibe. It is a responsibility. No authority, no access. No transparency, no money. No consent, no content. No oversight, no control. Those are not opinions. They're safeguards. And without them, nothing about this case, or the next one, will ever make sense. Which rule matters most to you? Authority, transparency, or no monetization? One word. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.